Years passed, and the bond between David, Ethan, and their unlikely guardian Scout only grew stronger. As David approached his 7th birthday, the reserve had become more than just his home. It was his playground, his classroom, and his sanctuary. The little boy who had once been abandoned on a dusty road had blossomed into a curious and adventurous child, with an uncanny ability to understand the wild creatures that shared his extraordinary world. Ethan watched with pride and amazement as his adopted son developed an almost mystical connection with the reserve's wildlife, particularly with Scout. The massive lion, now showing subtle signs of age in his graying mane, remained a constant presence in their lives. He would often appear seemingly out of nowhere whenever David ventured near the boundaries of their designated safe zones, as if maintaining his self-appointed role as the boy's protector. One particularly memorable morning, as dawn painted the African sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, David convinced his father to take him on an early game drive. The boy had been having vivid dreams about Scout, and something in his young heart told him that today would be special. Ethan, having learned to trust his son's unusual intuitions about the reserve's wildlife, agreed. As their jeep rumbled along the familiar dirt tracks, David suddenly pointed to a distant acacia tree. There, barely visible in the early morning light, was Scout. But something was different. The mighty lion wasn't alone. Beside him stood a young lioness, and playing around their feet were 3 tiny cubs. "Dad, look," David whispered, his eyes wide with wonder. "Scout has a family now, just like us." Ethan cut the engine, reaching for his binoculars to better observe this remarkable scene. Scout had indeed taken a mate, something the Rangers had suspected but hadn't been able to confirm until now. The lioness was young and strong, her coat gleaming in the morning sun, and the cubs appeared to be about 2 months old. As they watched, Scout's ears perked up, and his head turned toward their vehicle. Even at this distance, there was no mistaking the recognition in his golden eyes. To Ethan's amazement, the great lion rose and began walking toward them, pausing occasionally to look back at his family, as if assuring them all was well. "He wants to show them to us," David said with the simple certainty of a child who had never been taught to doubt the connection between humans and animals. "He's proud." Ethan knew they should maintain their distance. This was, after all, a wild lion with a new family to protect. But something in Scout's deliberate approach told him this was different. The lion stopped about 50 meters from their vehicle, sat down, and let out a soft rumbling sound that was neither a roar nor a growl. To Ethan's astonishment, his mate and cubs began to cautiously approach. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, they witnessed something few humans ever would: a family of lions choosing to share a moment of their lives with them. The cubs, emboldened by their parents' calm demeanor, played and tumbled in the grass while Scout and his mate lay nearby, their eyes never leaving David and Ethan. "They're like brothers and sisters I never had," David mused, his small hand pressed against the Jeep's window. "Do you think Scout remembered being alone too? Is that why he wanted to have cubs of his own?" Ethan felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Maybe, son. Animals feel things deeply, just like we do. Scout lost his family when he was very young, just like you. But look at him now. He's created something beautiful and new." The moment was interrupted by the crackle of Ethan's radio. Another ranger was reporting suspicious activity along the reserve's western boundary, possible poachers. Scout's ears immediately swiveled toward the sound, and within moments, he had shepherded his family back toward the safety of the Acacia GR. As they drove back to the ranger station, David remained unusually quiet, lost in thought. Finally, he spoke. "Dad, when I grow up, I want to protect them like you do. I want to make sure no cubs ever have to lose their moms like Scout did, like I did." Ethan reached over to squeeze his son's shoulder, remembering the frightened toddler he'd found on the road 4 years ago. "You already protect them, David. Your heart is so big, and you understand them in a way most people never will. That's a very special gift." That evening, as they sat on their cottage's porch watching the sunset, they heard Scout's distinctive roar rolling across the savannah. It was his nightly patrol call, a sound that had become as familiar and comforting as a lullaby to David. But tonight, it was joined by the higher-pitched calls of his cubs, practicing their own tiny roars. David smiled, leaning against his father's side. Our family keeps growing bigger, he said sleepily. Ethan looked down at his son, this miraculous boy who had taught him so much about love, courage, and the deep connections that could form between all living things. It sure does, son. It sure does. As night fell over the reserve, bringing with it the chorus of nocturnal creatures, Ethan reflected on the extraordinary path that had led them here. He thought about the desperate mother who had left her child, hoping he would find safety. If only she could see him now, thriving in this wild paradise, protected by the most unlikely guardian angel, a lion who had once known the same loss and fear as her son. The stars emerged one by one, spinning their ancient stories across the African sky. Somewhere out there, Scout kept watch over his growing pride. While in their cozy cottage, Ethan held his sleeping son close, grateful for the mysterious ways in which nature had brought them all together. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, and new opportunities to protect the magnificent creatures that shared their world. But for now, in this perfect moment, all was right in their extraordinary family's universe. The stars continued their celestial dance as a new day dawned over the reserve, bringing with it unexpected challenges that would test the unique bonds between David, Ethan, and their extended family of wild protectors. The morning air carried an unusual tension, the kind that animals sense long before humans catch wind of danger. David, now more attuned to the reserve's rhythms than ever, noticed it first. The birds had fallen silent, and even the usually chattering monkeys in the trees around their cottage maintained an eerie quiet. At breakfast, he tugged at Ethan's sleeve with urgent concern in his eyes. "Something's wrong, Dad. The animals are scared." Ethan had learned to trust his son's instincts, honed by years of living among the wildlife. Before he could respond, his radio crackled to life with alarming news. A large group of heavily armed poachers had been spotted entering the reserve under cover of darkness. This wasn't the usual opportunistic hunting party. This was an organized operation. As Ethan coordinated with other rangers and local authorities, David slipped out to the back porch, his heart pounding. He knew Scout's pride often rested near the waterhole during the early morning hours, directly in the poacher's likely path. The memory of Scout's own tragic origin story, losing his mother to poachers, weighed heavily on the boy's mind. Without thinking twice, David grabbed his emergency whistle and his father's spare radio. He knew every trail and hidden path in this section of the reserve, knowledge gained from countless dawn excursions with Ethan. If he could warn Scout's pride, maybe he could prevent history from repeating itself. The boy moved silently through the bush, using all the tracking skills his father had taught him. The morning mist still clung to the ground, providing additional cover. As he approached the water hole, he heard voices, rough, unfamiliar voices speaking in hushed tones. His heart nearly stopped when he recognized the sound of rifles being loaded. But then another sound cut through the morning air, the distinctive warning call of Scout's mate. The pride was still there, unknowingly vulnerable. David crouched lower in the tall grass, tears threatening to spill from his eyes. He couldn't let Scout lose his family like he'd lost his mother. He couldn't let those cubs become orphans. With trembling hands, he raised the radio to his lips and pressed the transmit button. "Dad," he whispered, "they're at the water hole. Scout's pride is here. Please hurry." The response was immediate and filled with panic. "David, where are you? Get out of there now." But before David could respond, a massive shape emerged from the grass beside him. Scout, his mane backlit by the rising sun, stood protectively over the boy. The lion's muscles were tense, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. Then, without warning, Scout let out the most powerful roar David had ever heard. The sound echoed across the reserve like a thunderclap, sending birds scattering into the sky. It was answered by other roars, not just from Scout's mate, but from other lions in the area. The poachers' voices turned from hushed to panicked as they realized they were surrounded by Africa's most formidable predators. Gunshots rang out, but they were wild, uncoordinated. Scout's pride had already moved to safety, while other lions emerged from different directions, creating chaos and confusion among the poachers. David stayed absolutely still beneath Scout's protective stance, watching in awe as the lion orchestrated what seemed like a coordinated defense of their shared home. The sound of approaching vehicles signaled the arrival of the rangers and local authorities. The poachers, their operation completely disrupted, scattered into the bush, only to run straight into the waiting arms of law enforcement who had circled around to cut off their escape routes. When Ethan finally found his son, the boy was sitting calmly in the grass, surrounded by Scout's entire pride. The cubs were playfully tumbling around him while their mother lounged nearby, as relaxed as if they were having a typical morning. Scout stood at attention, his posture proud and protective, until he was certain all danger had passed. The incident made headlines across the country. Lion pride helps thwart major poaching operation. But the real story, of a boy's courage and a lion's unwavering loyalty, remained known only to those who had witnessed it firsthand. That evening, as David recounted the morning's events to his father, Ethan noticed something different in his son's eyes, a deeper understanding of the responsibility they shared as guardians of this wild place. The boy who had once been abandoned on these grounds had found not just a family, but a purpose. The poachers, David said thoughtfully, they didn't understand, did they? They couldn't see that every animal here is connected, that we're all part of the same family. Ethan pulled his son close. No, they couldn't. But you do, and that makes you special. You and Scout. You both turned what could have been a tragedy into something beautiful. You both chose to protect rather than fear, to love rather than hate. As if in response, Scout's evening roar rolled across the savannah, followed by the chorus of his pride. This time, David recognized it for what it was, not just a territorial call, but a reminder of the extraordinary bonds that could form between species when fear gave way to understanding. Under the vast African sky, their unconventional family had grown stronger through adversity. The reserve was more than just a wildlife sanctuary now. It was a living testament to the power of compassion, courage, and the unshakable bonds between all living things. As darkness fell, David drifted off to sleep to the sound of distant lions, secure in the knowledge that in this corner of the world, love and protection transcended the boundaries of species, creating a legacy that would endure for generations to come. The legacy that began in this corner of the African wilderness continued to flourish and evolve in unexpected ways. As the years passed, David's experience with Scout's Pride had sparked a revolution in wildlife conservation practices across the continent. The story of a lion protecting an abandoned child, and then that same child growing up to protect an entire pride, had captured imaginations worldwide. David, now entering his teenage years, had become something of a legend among the local communities. Children from nearby villages would gather at the reserve's education center, their eyes wide with wonder as he taught them about wildlife conservation. He shared stories about Scout and his pride, but more importantly, he taught them about the delicate balance between humans and wildlife, and how understanding could replace fear. One particularly memorable morning, as dawn broke over the savannah, David led a group of young students to a safe observation point near Scout's territory. The mighty lion, his mane now streaked with silver, had become a grandfather several times over. His cubs had grown and established their own territories within the reserve, creating a network of protected areas that had dramatically reduced poaching incidents. "Watch how they move," David whispered to the children, pointing to where Scout's grandcubs played under their mother's watchful eyes. "They're not just playing, they're learning. Every pounce, every stalking game teaches them skills they'll need to survive." A small girl raised her hand, her voice trembling with excitement. "But why aren't they afraid of us being here?" David smiled, remembering how he had asked his father similar questions years ago. "Because they've learned, just as their parents and grandparents did, that not all humans bring danger. When we show respect and understanding, they show us trust in return." As if to demonstrate this point, Scout emerged from the tall grass, acknowledging their presence with a gentle rumble before settling down to watch his expanding family. The children gasped in collective awe, but there was no fear in their reactions, only wonder and respect. The success of David and Ethan's approach had led to the establishment of similar programs across other African reserves. Their method of combining traditional conservation with community education and involvement had created a new model for wildlife protection. Local villages, once in conflict with the reserve, now served as its strongest advocates. Back at the education center, David often found himself reflecting on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought him here. The abandoned child on a dusty road had found not just a human father in Ethan, but a wild protector in Scout, and together they had created something remarkable. The reserve had expanded, now encompassing additional territories that provided safe corridors for wildlife movement. Scout's descendants, carrying his distinctive protective instincts, had become known among rangers as particularly tolerant of human presence while remaining wild and free. Ethan, watching his son grow into a passionate conservationist, couldn't help but marvel at how their small family's story had transformed into a movement. Scientists came from around the world to study the unique dynamics between the lions and humans at the reserve, hoping to replicate their success elsewhere. One evening, as father and son sat on their familiar porch watching the sunset, they heard the unified roaring of Scout's extended pride, a sound that now echoed across a much larger territory than ever before. David turned to his father, his eyes reflecting the same determination they'd held on that fateful morning years ago when he'd helped thwart the poachers. "Dad, I think I finally understand why my birth mother left me here," he said softly. "She must have somehow known that this was where I belonged, not just to find a new family, but to be part of something bigger than all of us." Ethan nodded, recalling the security footage he'd watched so many years ago. The desperate mother who had kissed her child goodbye. She gave you a chance at life, and in doing so, she gave so many others a chance too. Every cub that grows up safely in this reserve, every child who learns to love instead of fear these animals, that's part of her legacy too. As night fell over the reserve, bringing with it the chorus of nocturnal life, a new chapter was already unfolding. Scout's latest grandcubs were growing strong. The next generation of community conservation leaders was being trained, and the boundaries between human fear and wild nature continued to dissolve. Their story had become a testament to the transformative power of love, courage, and understanding, proof that sometimes the most profound changes begin with a single act of compassion. In this sacred space where a lion had once protected an abandoned child, a new kind of world was taking shape, one where the lines between family and species blurred, and where the ancient dance between humans and wildlife found a new rhythm of coexistence and mutual protection. In this sacred space where humans and wildlife had found a new rhythm of coexistence, an unprecedented transformation was taking place. As the African moon rose high above the reserve, casting silver light across the expanding territories, David found himself standing at the threshold of an even greater mission. The legacy of Scout and his pride had sparked a revolution that was about to change the face of conservation forever. International conservation organizations had taken notice of the reserve's unique approach, and David, now in his late teens, had been invited to share their methodology at a global wildlife summit in Nairobi. The night before his departure, he made his way to Scout's favorite resting place, where the aging lion spent most of his evenings watching over his ever-growing family. Scout's presence had grown almost mythical among the local communities. His silver-maned figure had become a symbol of hope and protection, not just for the wildlife, but for the entire ecosystem that sustained both animals and humans. As David approached, the great lion acknowledged him with the same gentle rumble that had comforted him throughout his childhood. "I wouldn't be here without you, old friend," David whispered, settling down near Scout. The lion's cubs and grandcubs played nearby, their activities illuminated by the bright African moon. "Tomorrow, I'll tell your story to people from all over the world. Maybe they'll understand what we've learned here, that fear is a choice, and that protection goes both ways." The summit in Nairobi would prove to be just the beginning. David's presentation, backed by years of data and countless success stories, captured the imagination of conservation leaders worldwide. The model they had developed, one that combined traditional wildlife protection with community involvement and cross-species understanding, was revolutionary in its simplicity and effectiveness. Back at the reserve, Ethan had been implementing new technologies to support their expanding mission. Drone surveillance systems now worked in harmony with the lion's natural protective instincts, creating an unprecedented network of wildlife security. The local community members, once skeptical of conservation efforts, had become integral parts of this network, their traditional knowledge enhancing the effectiveness of modern conservation techniques. Scouts' Pride had grown to become one of the largest and most stable in Africa. What made them truly unique was their unusual behavior. While remaining completely wild, they displayed an extraordinary tolerance for human preys. NCE when it came to conservation activities. Scientists studying this phenomenon discovered that this behavioral trait was being passed down through generations, creating what they called the guardian pride effect. As David's influence grew, other reserves began adopting their methods. The results were remarkable. Poaching incidents decreased dramatically in areas where local communities were actively involved in conservation efforts. The story of the abandoned boy and his lion protector had evolved into a movement that was reshaping the relationship between humans and wildlife across the continent. One evening, as David returned from another successful community outreach program, he found Scout waiting near the education center. The lion's age was showing, but his eyes still held the same fierce intelligence that had saved a crying child so many years ago. Behind him, his latest generation of cubs tumbled and played, their future now more secure than ever. A group of local children had gathered at a safe distance, their eyes wide with wonder as they watched the interaction between David and Scout. One small boy raised his hand hesitantly. "Will we ever have what you have with Scout?" he asked. David smiled, recognizing in the child's question the same longing for connection that had defined his own journey. "What Scout taught us," he replied, "is that every animal has the capacity to trust, and every human has the capacity to protect. It's not about taming the wild, it's about learning to be part of it." As the sun set over the reserve, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, the sound of lions roaring echoed across the landscape. But now, these roars were not met with fear in the surrounding villages. Instead, they were welcomed as the voices of protectors, of family, of hope for a future where humans and wildlife could thrive together. The legacy that had begun with a single act of protection, a lion guarding an abandoned child, had grown into a movement that was redefining conservation across Africa. In the hearts of those who witnessed it, the story of Scout and David had become more than just a tale of unlikely friendship. It had become a blueprint for a new kind of coexistence, where the boundaries between species dissolved in the face of mutual understanding and protection. The boundaries between species continued to dissolve in remarkable ways, as the success story of Scout and David's reserve began inspiring change far beyond Africa's borders. Their revolutionary approach to conservation had caught the attention of wildlife preserves in India, where tiger populations were struggling against human encroachment and poaching. A delegation of Indian conservationists had arrived at the reserve to witness firsthand the extraordinary relationship between humans and wildlife that had developed there. David, now in his early 20s, found himself increasingly traveling between continents, sharing the wisdom gained from his unique upbringing. But his heart always remained with Scout and the expanding pride that had become synonymous with hope in African conservation. The aging lion, though less active than in his prime, maintained his role as the spiritual center of their movement. One particularly memorable evening, as David led the Indian delegation to observe Scout's Pride, something unprecedented occurred. A young tigress that had been rescued and rehabilitated in India had recently been released in a similar community-integrated reserve. The conservationists shared video footage of the tigress displaying remarkably similar protective behaviors toward local villages as Scout had shown years ago. "It's as if the animals can sense when we're trying to help," one of the Indian conservationists remarked, watching Scout's grandcubs playing near a group of local children participating in a wildlife education program. They're choosing to become partners in their own protection. The evidence. It was becoming impossible to ignore. Across different species and continents, when given the opportunity to coexist peacefully with humans who approach them with respect and understanding, many large predators were showing unprecedented levels of tolerance and even protective instincts. Scientists were documenting similar phenomena with wolves in Europe and jaguars in South America. Back at the reserve, Ethan had established an international training center where conservationists from around the world could learn their integrated approach. The curriculum was unique, combining traditional wildlife management with the emotional intelligence and cross-species understanding that David had learned from his extraordinary childhood experiences. Scout's influence continued to ripple outward in unexpected ways. His descendants, now spread across several reserves in Africa, all showed the same remarkable capacity for peaceful coexistence with respectful human activities. Researchers studying this phenomenon had begun to understand that what they were witnessing wasn't just learned behavior. It was an evolutionary adaptation to a new kind of relationship between humans and wildlife. One morning, as dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, David received news that would once again transform their understanding of wildlife conservation. A pride of lions in a neighboring country, descended from one of Scout's daughters who had been relocated years ago, had been observed protecting a small village from armed bandits. The lions had positioned themselves between the threat and the village, their presence alone deterring the attack. "It's exactly what Scout did for me," David explained to a group of astonished researchers. "These animals aren't just surviving alongside us anymore, they're choosing to be guardians of the entire ecosystem, including the humans who have learned to respect and protect them." The implications were staggering. What had begun as one lion's compassionate response to an abandoned child had evolved into a new paradigm of conservation, where predators and humans formed mutual protection societies. The old model of conservation, based on separation and control, was giving way to something far more powerful, a partnership that crossed species boundaries. As David shared these developments with Ethan on their familiar porch, Scout made his way slowly up the path toward them, followed by his latest generation of cubs. The great lion's mane was now almost completely silver, but his eyes still held the same wisdom and strength that had changed so many lives. "Look at that," Ethan said softly, pointing to where Scout's cubs were being approached by a group of local children under their parents' watchful eyes. The cubs, instead of retreating, calmly accepted the presence of the young humans, even sitting down to observe their movements with curious expressions. "They're teaching each other," David realized. "The cubs are learning that humans can be trusted, and the children are learning that wild animals can be respected without being feared. This is how real change happens, one generation teaching the next." The sun set over the reserve, casting long shadows across the land that had witnessed this extraordinary evolution in human-wildlife relations. In the distance, the sound of lions roaring mingled with the laughter of children heading home from their wildlife observation session. The boundaries between species had not just dissolved. They had been transformed into bridges of understanding that were reshaping conservation efforts around the world.